Struggling. Struggling is a physics-based co-op platformer where you play as a horrific creature named Troy, making your way through a variety of absurd challenges and worlds. I was first introduced to Struggling about 2 years ago at a booth in PAX East 2018, and when it was released on Steam I purchased it immediately. In the following 2 days, I beat the entire game, twice. I continued playing, and after getting pretty good with the controls, I introduced the game to my younger sister by playing 2-player mode with her. I used to fly through the rooms when I had control of both of my arms, but now I could only control one, and had to communicate every action I made to another human being. It made the game harder, regardless of who was holding the other controller. Despite having control of only one arm, I almost felt that it would be faster if she did absolutely nothing. And that was my motivation for trying to beat as much of Struggling as possible with the control of only one arm. Of course, being able to control both your arms is entirely required to beat the game. Once you can detach your arms and operate them remotely, which is unlocked partway through the game, it's physically impossible to solve the easiest of puzzles without the use of your other arm. The whole point of the game is to force you to make use of both arms, especially when working with another player, so this barrier isn't too unexpected. But what about before you can detach your arms? You only unlock that ability partway through the second chapter of the game, but what about the first chapter, Lab? In my mind it seemed possible, just maybe, to beat Lab with only one arm, and I soon realized that would become the hardest challenge in Struggling. Even before starting my attempts, I was hit with an interesting dilemma. Which arm do I even use? Well, it's a bit hard to tell at first, but Troy's arms aren't positioned in the exact middle of his head. They rest slightly below the middle, so that both arms can rest entirely on the ground at once, keeping Troy's head from wobbling in this state. I knew it would be problematic to use my blue left hand, despite the left joystick being the default for movement on a controller, since on an incline it's extremely difficult to reach over your head and right arm and to be able to grab the ground and bring yourself forward. That's why using my red right hand, and therefore right joystick, is the correct choice. The majority of Lab proceeds towards the right, so it makes sense to use the arm on that side. Now that I got that out of the way, I could pick up my controller and get started with the actual challenge. In reality, the majority of the chapter is pretty easy to beat with one arm. The challenges are meant to be relatively easy for completely new players, it's difficult to die, and if all else fails, I could just take my time on the tough parts. Just like for regular new players, the gameplay slowly ramped up in difficulty. At first, all I had to do was move on flat ground. Then I had to start climbing. And then I had to get decent at swinging. But it was all pretty manageable and didn't really take too much time. This part was a bit hard at first, since you can't ever really adjust your grip with only one arm, but I managed to find a safe strategy that, while a bit slow, is much faster than playing risky again and again. That's when I made a breakthrough. Initially, all I was doing to drag myself along was grabbing the ground, pulling myself forward, and releasing. But if I released too late, I would flip over the arm. In other words, my arm would be pointing backwards at the end of my swing, and that meant that whenever I jumped off a platform, it would be in the wrong place to catch the next platform ahead of me. That was a problem, since I had to jump much more often with my smaller wingspan. Well, the solution surprisingly already existed within the game. Since all of the player's movement is based on in-game physics, it's easy for the game to make mistakes. Your arms sometimes glitch into the wall, twist through themselves, and get stuck in each other. There had to be some way to reset your arms, or the game would essentially be unplayable for any player. So that's why you can delete and regenerate your arm with Y. I realized that if I pressed Y immediately after jumping, I could grab the following ledge at the highest possible point with my newly regenerated arm. That led to massive improvements in running, climbing, and of course jumping, and that revived my hopes that this challenge was possible. For each of the previous sections, I depended on patience and careful movements to get by. No part of the game was meant to be played as slow and methodically as I was being, but that was the best I can do with only one arm. The easy part was dragging my head from room to room, but what made it so difficult was having to drag my limp left arm everywhere I went as well, which is heavier and further than my head from my functional arm. I was a one-armed creature in a two-armed world, but it felt like I had a pretty good grasp on the challenge so far. Until the rat chase. The rat chase challenged all of the skill I had acquired since the very first time I played Struggling. This avalanche of rodents follows you through a vent system in a warehouse, and if you ever slow down, if you ever make a mistake, you get eaten alive by the approaching horde. The first part of the chase was difficult, and it forced me to develop even faster ways to move with only one arm. If I pulled myself along using the top of the vent instead of the bottom, I could generate more momentum and avoid having to regenerate my arm. This incline was the most difficult section of part 1, since, obviously, it's an incline, but I was eventually able to get some decent momentum and get past that area. All I had to do was drag myself down the rest of the vents, making use of my momentum to aim myself in the right direction, and I was able to pass part 1 in a sizable yet respectable 19 attempts. And now part 2. Instead of moving downwards, you have to climb up to escape the rising wave of rats, something that's incredibly difficult to do with one arm. Here's a clip of me beating it normally. With 78 seconds to get from the bottom of this warehouse to the top, beating this section with 2 arms is pretty easy. As long as you don't entirely miss a jump or get stuck too many times, you could probably beat it within a few tries as a beginner. With a bit more practice, the rats aren't even concerning anymore. But with one hand, every box is a new challenge, and every jump is nearly impossible. To summarize my hours of struggle towards beating this minute-long section of the game, I've laid out 7 comprehensive factors that forced me to evolve my strategies and pay more and more attention to every move I made. Speed. Speed is the first and most important factor to the difficulty of this level, because even though 78 seconds seems like a lot, and it kinda is when you have access to both arms, with just one arm it leaves no room for mistakes. For each of the following sections I had about 13 seconds on average to complete them, which at points required near perfect movement. As you enter part 2 of the rat chase, you have to climb over this assortment of boxes to the right. How fast you get up these boxes essentially decides how far you'll get on each attempt, so it's really crucial to get this part right. The perfect run would be grabbing exactly once for every box, so that's what's been playing in the background in addition to a helpful grab counter. That brings us to this jump. It may be surprising to you, but when playing normally, the momentum you generate by moving your back arm is really important to how far you go. To show this, here's what happens if you lift yourself with both joysticks versus just one. You can't even fully lift yourself off the ground with one arm, so getting a good jump at any level of consistency takes a lot of practice and effort. I also had to make sure that I landed in a perfect spot to start the jump, since if I landed too far back, I would grab too far back and undershoot the jump, while if I landed too far forward, I would grab the side of the box instead of the top, completely killing my jump. In my first 200 attempts, I probably died here 90% of the time, or at least landed too far down the wall to have enough time for the later sections. On an incredibly good jump, I could land high enough that I only needed one more swing to reach the top, but most of the time I needed 2 or 3 swings at best, which wasted so much of my very limited time. Up next was the first swing. This section gave me the most options of how to proceed, meaning I could throw the run in increasingly creative ways. I tried just reaching for the swing, but you have to be perfectly positioned on the end of the box to reach the corner of it, and most of the times I either fall off the edge without grabbing it, or it takes so long to make it work that the strategy isn't even viable anymore. Another strategy I found was pulling myself to the corner, then folding my body over my left arm to gain a bit more height than just grabbing from the ground. This had a higher success rate than my previous strategy, but had the same flaws. Either I missed, which happened a lot, or it just took too long. The last strategy, which I developed much later, was pulling myself over to and grabbing the corner, flipping myself over the box, and then lifting myself, releasing, and grabbing onto the swing. This was the most consistent strategy of them all. It was actually pretty fast compared to the other 2 methods. Now that I could grab the swing, I had to make another decision. Do I go over or under it? While the top was safer, it was hard to get up there quickly. The bottom got me to the other side faster, but it was incredibly risky to do and landed me further down the wall on the rare attempt that it actually worked. I went ahead with the top path and figured out the movement necessary to get myself over the lip of the swing fairly quickly and consistently. Now onto the next set of swings. At this point, the attempts where I made it this far were few and far between. If I made any mistakes in the previous sections, the rats were already too high for me to go from platform to platform, and it was still all over. In order to get from the first platform to the second, I had 2 methods to choose from. Either I could fling myself far enough that I would roll over my left hand and be able to grab the second platform, or I could just land far enough back to have the room to drag myself to the right place. Since these platforms swing, and I have to pull myself over to the right, the first platform would start swinging left, meaning that in many cases I was either too slow to grab onto the swing, or I would successfully grab it, but my left arm would fall low enough to get caught by the rats, still pulling me under. The next challenge I had was actually swinging to the other side of that second swing. Most players are able to get to this point fast enough that they have access to this platform, but since the gap is so big and the rats get too high already, I don't have that liberty. The only viable method is to swing hard enough to skip the platform. Just pulling forward doesn't work, since you don't get enough distance, so the only viable method is to swing back for a little bit, then swing forward and jump at the last possible moment. If I didn't swing hard enough, initially position myself in the right place, or jump at the perfect time, I wouldn't get the distance to reach high enough on the wall. And if that does happen, there's still one more tough part to get through. That's actually escaping through the vent, which with one hand is harder than it seems. Usually when I try to go up some kind of wall, I have room to swing around from the other direction, but with constricting walls of the vent, that isn't possible. That's why I developed this strategy, where I pull myself up high enough that my head tilts over my right arm, allowing me to regenerate my arm and grab higher up on the wall. Without that tilt, the hand regenerates an empty space and you fall down again. After doing it correctly once or twice, you would be high enough to grab onto the slanted part of the vent and pull yourself through, marking the end of the rat chase. These clips I assembled to demonstrate all of the challenges of this run weren't from completed runs. That's because with this information, I still couldn't beat this challenge. 632 attempts, or over 5 hours of trying, and on the 2 or 3 times I got to that final swing, the rats were too high for me to catch the falling wall of boxes. At that point, I was burnt out. I just gave up. I stopped playing Struggling almost entirely for a full month. Who wouldn't after dying over 600 times trying to beat 1 minute of a video game? Despite giving up, I still didn't entirely distance myself from Struggling. I still kept tabs on the Struggling Discord, and when the game's developers announced a dev stream where they were testing stuff for the upcoming update, I thought I'd hop on for a few minutes. The whole reason why I was watching this stream was to get a sneak peek of the new content, but something else caught my eye. Troy was moving a bit weird. It was almost as if his arms abided by slightly different physics than I was used to. Somehow the dev was able to move a bit faster and get a bit more momentum on his swings. I thought it might be some kind of new setting he turned on, but when he went back to the menu and started a new save file, I noticed something. He wasn't playing on a controller like me, which is what the game explicitly tells you to do whenever you open the game. He was using his mouse and keyboard. I opened up the game because I just couldn't believe it, but when I hopped into a new save file, it was true. Mouse and keyboard allows for faster movement, specifically the mouse arm. I still don't know exactly why, but the way the game treats inputs from the mouse is fundamentally different from how it treats inputs from the keyboard or the joysticks in a controller. All I needed to beat the rat chase was saving, 1 second on each obstacle? That's all I needed to regain my hope that beating Rat Chase Part 2 with one arm was possible. Just 88 mouse attempts later, this happened. I did it! An idea more than a month old finally realized. All I had to do was beat the final section of the game, which took maybe 15 more minutes, and I became the first person in the world to beat the first chapter of Struggling with one arm. Of course, there isn't that much contention for that title, but if I could make a 14-minute long video describing everything I went through to make it happen, I feel like I've earned the title out of pure time investment. I hope you liked the video, since it's been the biggest video project I've ever undertaken, and it's hopefully a step in the right direction for the kind of content I'll be sharing on this channel. If you did, please consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all next time.